our history of Christian mission. I'm certainly really enjoying researching this. It's a series I've taught before, but I'm teaching it now in slightly more depth, and I'm not giving myself any date when the whole thing will finish. We'll just make our way through. Just to remind you where we're at, we arrived at a watershed really last week when we looked at the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine and how that changed everything, more or less permanently, actually, certainly for the Roman Empire from that moment onwards. You'll remember that he had this vision in the sky shortly before engaging a battle with one of the rivals who could possibly be an emperor, called Maxentius. And at that battle, which he won, before it he saw a vision, and the vision was a cross or some sort of shape in the sky that said, "By this sign you shall conquer." And so the whole thing began. The battle, as I say, was won, and everything changed within the Roman Empire. Now, Maxentius wasn't the only challenge that he faced. If he wanted to make himself supreme and only emperor, there were 6 other wannabe emperors who'd have to be removed. And one of those was Licinius. He held the eastern part of the empire, and in defeating him, it opened up the east of the empire where Licinius had been operating, and particularly the city of Byzantium. So what I want to do is to share with you 3 new things today. We're going to look at new destination, and this is all a consequence from the conversion of Constantine. A new destination, a new doctrine, and a new development. That's what we're going to look at. So what I want to do, first of all, is to look at this city of Byzantium. So I'm going to hold this up. I hope this is going to work. It has worked okay before. Now, if you look carefully at this map, you should be able to see. I'm going in here. There is Byzantium, okay, as it was formerly called. Here you can see Asia Minor, that's modern day Turkey. And Byzantium is right on the edge of the eastern outpost of the empire. If you consider Rome as the capital, that was the historic capital. Here in Byzantium, you're reaching into further territories that could be discovered and could be explored. Now, Byzantium is actually not joined to Asia Minor, to Turkey. It doesn't show it very well here, but there's a very narrow piece of water there. It's called the Bosphorus. It's like a strait, and it provides access to the rest of Asia. It's actually in Europe. So it's right at the crossroads between Europe, which is to the west, and Asia, which is to the east. And so Constantine realized that this would be a strategic place in which to establish a base. And in defeating Licinius, it opened up this whole eastern area of the Roman Empire. It was very strategic because not only did it separate Europe from Asia, it didn't just separate east-west, it separated the north and the south as well. It gave a command and a control of that narrow channel through which any who were going to travel would do so by sea from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. It controlled the route from the Balkans into Asia, specifically Asia Minor. It allowed quick access to the Danube frontier, the natural northern frontier for the empire. Once again, if you can see that, you'll see there the northern frontier. The river Danube was, as I say, a natural demarcation point. And it was north of the Danube where the barbarian tribes were constantly presenting a challenge. So it really was a key location. It was a key location for military advancement. It was a key location for commercial success as well. And it was far more strategic than Rome, around which the empire had grown up. Rome was quite isolated. So again, if you look at Rome here in Italy, you'll see Rome was some 27 kilometers or 17 miles from the sea. And in the later days of the empire, it was poorer, it was more rural, and it was less successful in business. And while, of course, Rome was always the ancient historical capital, by the end of the 4th century, that mantle had really been taken from Rome and placed on Byzantium. So Constantine was a good strategist. He could see it had excellent potential for expansion. It was also be good for the administrative capital. So he decided to make it the capital of the Roman Empire. And in the process, he changed its name from Byzantium to Constantinople, a city he modestly named after himself. It means the city of Constantine, and gave him a very important eastern outpost to the Roman Empire. Now, this division of the empire into 2 separate parts would eventually become permanent. I mean, what special relationship today does Constantinople, which of course today is Istanbul, have with Rome? Or indeed, what is special about a relationship between Italy and Turkey? None that I'm particularly aware of. But Constantinople was intended to be a new Rome. And so all the infrastructure was brought in. There were aqueducts, parks, stadia, offices, libraries, and interestingly, where churches would be much more important than temples. And so it had its own government, its own senate. And one thing that he did there was there was a huge area called the Hippodrome, and he had that enlarged so it could accommodate 50,000 people. It was a big arena that was used for entertainment of the people, but of course, praise the Lord, no longer persecution and wicked murder of Christians. It was now used for public acts of the state or political ceremonies. And Constantinople would stand unconquered for 1100 years. Perhaps the most precious gift was an order that Constantine made as his new capital city was being built. He told his friend and biographer, Bishop Eusebius, to have 50 great Bibles made in finely bound volumes and distributed to the churches. Now, many churches in the earlier persecution had experienced that ugly knock on the door and the demand by the soldiers for them to hand over copies of the Christian scriptures. And many indeed had been handed over under the threat of death. Many had been burned. Manuscripts that had taken months to copy. Pages filled with words of life, words that gave instruction and hope to the fledgling church. And I imagine many times, no doubt, Christians had huddled together and wondered whether all their scriptures were doomed to the ashes. But now, of course, the tide has turned. And the empire itself was ordering the manufacture of the Bibles, and magnificent Bibles at that, and all at state expense. Wow, how things had changed. But Constantinople's name would be changed once again in 1453 by Sultan Muhammad II, changed from Constantinople to Istanbul, when it became the new capital of the expanding Ottoman Empire. We will revisit Byzantium, Constantinople, Istanbul later this year when we look at the tragic response of the church to the advance of Islam. So that's new destination. New doctrine. Well, I mentioned it last week, but I need to mention it again because although I'm not teaching doctrine, it's so crucial to understand this because it affected in some ways how missionary work was done in some areas, as you're going to see later. Arius, an elder in Alexandria, declared that when Jesus is described as God or the Son of God, they are but courtesy titles. Arius said this: even if he is called God, he is not God truly, but by participation in grace. He too is called God in name only. So he was implying that Christ is inferior to God in both his nature and his dignity. He was not co-eternal, he was not co-equal with God, but he was created. Now, one man challenged Arius and opposed his views. He was called Athanasius. And Athanasius became the Bishop of Alexandria. He rose to meet the challenge. He asserted that Christ, the Son, is eternal, and that the Father and the Son were of the same substance, were of the same essence, of the same, not similar, but of the same. And his concern rightly was that if Christ were a mere creation of God, he could not possibly bring salvation to man. The argument actually hinged on two Greek words that have only one letter distinguishing them from each other. So let me try and show you this. Okay, here we are. Here are the two Greek words, homoousios and homoousios. Not much difference, is there? Actually, if you look carefully, there's only one letter difference. There's an additional letter in the top word. But these words have two completely different meanings. Homoousios, the top one, means similar. The bottom one, homoousios, means the same. So homo, you know, in words like homogeneous or homosexual, it means the same. Was Christ homoousios to God, similar to God, or was he homoousios, the same as God? And actually, as I say, the only difference is one letter. Get the top of this pen. It's this letter here. The letter I. Well, it's the letter I in our alphabet, but in the Greek alphabet, it's the iota. We use the word iota in English, don't we? We say, oh, it doesn't make an iota of difference. It's so small. Actually, there was a war over an iota here. That's how important it was. Is Jesus similar to God? Is he just divine? Or is he deity? Is he the same as God? And believe it or not, that was at the heart of this battle, which has huge repercussions. So different people took different sides in the battle. Godlike or God? Divinity or deity? Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria and a senior leader in the church, didn't mince his words. He accused Arius of blasphemy. This is what he said. The impious Arius, the forerunner of Antichrist, has dared to utter his blasphemies against the divine Redeemer. Well, the Roman Emperor Constantine, he got involved in all this. He tried to pour oil on troubled waters, but his intervention did little to help. In fact, I would suggest it caused more trouble. I mean, why is an emperor getting involved in a matter that should be discussed and decided amongst the church, amongst those who are qualified, who have a history and a knowledge of these things? He basically said, come on, chaps, the difference between you are so minute that what you're saying is really the same thing at the end of the day. So just forget your little disagreements and become friends. Well, the crucial doctrine of the deity of Christ, as expressed by Athanasius, was set down in words and became known as the Athanasian Creed, which is regularly recited in some churches, particularly Anglican churches today. And in it are his words describing Jesus, where it says, very God of very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father. Have you ever sung that? Well, you will be in a few weeks' time, because if you're going to sit down or stand up and join a crowd, if we can join a crowd and sing in a few weeks' time, "O come all ye faithful," when you get to verse 2, you'll sing, God of God, light of light, lo, he abhors not the virgin's womb. Very God, begotten, not created, oh come let us adore him, etc. This whole thing became known as the Arian controversy, or Arian controversy. By the way, Arian is spelled A-R-I-A-N, not A-R-Y-A-N. That's more about the Nazi intentions way back. This is about Arius. And far from being over, it continues to resurrect itself throughout the history of the church. And as we're going to see in a moment, in various guises, it still can be found to exist, particularly in the cults, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses, who conveniently have their own translation, the New World Translation, that deals with some of these important verses in a slightly different way. And even the Mormons have their book, the Book of Mormon, to counter maybe what they see as a mistranslation in the Bible. These people deny the Trinity. Now, as I said to you, the conversion of Constantine to Christianity took place just before a major battle. And after that, the church would never be the same again. You could almost draw a line down the middle. You could have BC, which is before Constantine, and AC, after Constantine. And overnight, Christians were transformed from being despised outcasts with a vibrant testimony to people of distinction, wealth, and power. While facing completely new problems they were ill-equipped and inexperienced to deal with. I found one writer who said, we enter a whole new era with a whole new peril. And while there were some exceptions, for the most part, the church and mission were tainted with some of these negative aspects that followed from the conversion of Constantine, which affected both key doctrinal beliefs as well as the daily practice of the faith. So from now on, for the next 1,000 years, when we talk about the church, when we talk about evangelism, when we talk about mission, we're talking in the main about the Roman Catholic Church, which was really the main church in existence, and which, as it evolved over the centuries, gathered to itself a number of doctrines which cannot really be found in the Bible today. So the Roman Catholic Church dominated life and society until the Reformation, when Protestants emerged. Now, can I just say there were two exceptions, small groups. One were those who chose to retain their pagan beliefs and their pagan worship. But there was another small group who were Celtic Christians. Celtic Christians remained closer to the biblical description of the early church. And I'll tell you more about them in future weeks, because they also had a significant role to play. So, the Roman Empire was keen to expand its territory, expand its influence. And that happened because of Roman soldiers who would go to the borders and wage war against the different tribes around the borders. So this is how it worked. Having conquered your enemy, perhaps a neighboring tribe, the defeated people were then colonized, a combination of imposing on them a new government, maybe a new language, a new culture, and a new religion. That was part of the colonization package. It was all mixed up with politics and strategy and everything else. So these people who had become captives were declared to be Christian, usually through baptism, and then expected to follow the invaders' religion. Something in many cases they did with extreme reluctance and probably some ongoing personal hostility. It's sad, isn't it? Evangelism, if you can call it that, had become entangled and confused with politics and military expansion. But it follows logically, doesn't it, from the original vision that Constantine had. A cross in the sky, by this sign, conquer. And so he could see that just as in the old republic, pagan religion had been a powerful uniting force, now it could be the same again, but the religion that could unite everybody, which he chose, was Christianity. So we had new destination, new doctrine, and finally, a new development in missions. Now, here is just one example in the history of Christian mission of a movement which had much zeal and much to commend it, but which was yet tainted by some of the erroneous doctrines circulating in those days. Let me introduce you to Ulfilas. And if you've got your hand out there with you, you'll see Ulfilas and his dates. Born in AD 311. So, the church and the state became allied, and missionaries were viewed in a political light because they would help territorial expansion. Effective evangelistic efforts were welcome because they would bring more areas under Roman control. So let me introduce you to Ulfilas and his work amongst the Goths. The Goths lived in what is today basically Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. The outskirts and the borders of the empire were constantly threatened by these untamed barbarians who could destabilize the Roman state. Listen to this for a description, and I wonder if you'd like to work amongst this group. They appeared huge, bearded, filthy men, some in rough armor of reeking animal skins, some spattered with human blood, shouting and even singing. And Ulfilas ministered to the pagan Goths, a barbarian tribe in Dacia. Dacia is modern-day Romania. If you look again here, if you can see here, There's the Danube. That was the border for the then Roman Empire. And across the border, across the Danube, you have Dacia, one of the places where the Goths were found. Dacia, the Dacia car, I think they still have the same name, don't they? Originates from Romania. You know, the, what's it called? Duster, I think it's called. Huge, great car. And the word Gothic was originally used to describe, in a somewhat derogatory way, a new style of architecture, or the word was taken to describe a new style of architecture that wasn't liked. So back to Ulfilas. Born in AD 311, raised in the pagan environment of Goths, and even given a Gothic name. His mother is believed to have been Gothic, but his father, who was captured by Gothic raiders, was a Christian from Cappadocia. That's really the very center today of modern-day Turkey. And the captivity of Christians was one of the ways, incredibly, in which Christianity penetrated the northern barbarian tribes. Ulfilas was well educated. He was fluent in Latin and Greek. And so in his early 20s, he was sent on a diplomatic service to Constantinople, where he heard and came under the influence of Bishop Eusebius, a very popular, a very persuasive Christian preacher who taught him the scriptures in Latin and Greek. But Eusebius was very much influenced by Aryanism. And Arius was a contemporary of Ulfilas. So Ulfilas became an Arian, or maybe we should say a semi-Arian Christian. I mean, this doctrine was overruled at the Council of Nicaea, but some of the churchmen, particularly in the outlying areas in the eastern part of the empire, continued to hold to this view. So according to one writer, the Aryanism that Ulfilas professed was a mild form. He was consecrated at the age of 30 to be a bishop to the Goths. So that does indicate there were already quite a number of Christians amongst the Goths. Otherwise, they wouldn't have had a bishop amongst them. But it was very difficult ministering amongst these wild people. However, it was also successful. Listen to this report. Ulfilas' ministry was to a people considered barbarians, wild and undisciplined, a rude and crude sort, with a relatively low standard of living, dwelling often in wagons because they had no fixed abodes. Stephen Neal says, to such simple people, Aryanism may have presented itself as a rather attractive simplification, since it set them free from the knotty controversies about the nature and person of Christ, to follow him as a leader and to concentrate on the already sufficiently difficult task of learning to live a sober, righteous, and godly life. Ulfilas has to be commended because he was in a place where there was frequent opposition and serious persecution. In fact, twice he had to move from Dacia across the Danube back inside the Roman Empire just for safety of his converts. But what's interesting is some of those converts later themselves went back as missionaries across the Danube to their own people. Ulfilas reduced language that they spoke to writing. Now that was no mean feat because he had to devise an alphabet from the sounds that they were making, and he used Greek and Latin characters to write the language down. He then translated the Bible. I want you to realize how significant this was. This was probably only the first or second time anybody had attempted to take a language which wasn't written down, create an alphabet, write it down, and then translate the Bible. And then, of course, you've got to set up literary classes to teach all these people how to read. This isn't an overnight job. This takes years and years. The first or second time it was done, I just read that Wycliffe has just celebrated translating the Bible into the 700th language. So the work continues today. So what was his translation like? Well, apparently it was good. He was careful in rendering an almost word-for-word translation from the Greek without losing the Gothic idiom. But he omitted deliberately 1 and 2 Kings and 1 and 2 Samuel. Why? Well, as you realize, he was working amongst a very warlike, aggressive, primitive people. And if you've read 1 and 2 Kings and 1 and 2 Samuel, you'll know there's a lot of bloodshed and battles and wars inside those writings. So he believed that there was a greater need to check their behavior than to encourage it, which he feared reading those books would do. So they never had 1 and 2 Kings and 1 and 2 Samuel. That's a shame, because this time next week, I'll be teaching 1 and 2 Kings in Serbia. Some of the Christian Goths and Vandals, this was another group, carried the Bible with them as they traveled. Vandals, you know the name well, they were a Germanic people who ravaged Gaul and Spain in the 5th century, and in AD 455, they even sacked Rome. They were notorious for their delight in wanton, pointless destruction, which is how the sobriquet has come to us today. As Chadwick wrote in his book, The Early Church, the Goths did become the principal missionaries to the other Germanic tribes, each of which tended to become Christian a few years after settling within the empire. Was that because immigration into the civilized Roman Empire was felt to entail an acceptance of Christianity? Well, after 40 commendable years of service, 40 years, Ulfilas died aged 70, but the work was carried on by his successors amidst great difficulties. You have to commend the bravery, the persistence, and the sacrificial lifestyle they had to live to dwell amongst these people. They followed their wagons wherever they went, these missionaries, even accompanying the tribesmen to the battlefield. One anti-Aryan critic sarcastically commented, "Those who'd formerly used wagons for dwellings now used wagons for churches." I don't see that as a criticism. I see that as very wonderful. However, as the writer Raymond Edman observed, like Paul, they were all things to all men, so that they might by all means save some. Their doctrine perhaps was defective, but their hearts were not. They sought service, not security, comradeship in Christ, not a cathedral, discipleship, not domination. So there, as we look at somebody like Ulfilas, we can be challenged on many different levels, and thankful for those people who gave so much so that the pagan tribes could come to know Jesus, their Lord and Saviour. So there we are. That takes us to the end of today's talk, but I've just got a few little notices I want to share with you. First one is this. Simultaneously with me recording this on Zoom, it's being recorded, you can't see, but there's a camera doing a recording. I hope it's worked out. And of course, if your Zoom is fluctuating, it's sometimes cutting off or going quiet or distorted. Hopefully this recording will be a pure recording. And what we will do, if this works out, is not only send you the Zoom link, we'll also send you the recording link. The second thing to say is this: we're going to have a little break from this. Not that I want a break, but this time next week, as I said, I'm going to be in Serbia. I'll be preaching in some village church somewhere. And in fact, I'm going to be there for 3 Sundays, preaching in different churches, but mainly I'll be teaching 1 and 2 Kings, the very books that Ulfilas didn't want to translate for the Goths. And also I'll be teaching the prophecy of Ezekiel, quite a heavy schedule of 6 lectures a day. I value your prayers for that. So our next meeting is November the 15th, okay? I've been going non-stop since the middle of May. I've loved it. I'd like to carry on, but we're going to have a break. So put November the 15th in your diary, and I'll see you then.